coming, obviously the first thing we would do is get the trucks out there and pre-salt the roads, and as soon as snow flew in the middle of the night, we would have trucks running, clearing the roads. Woke up this morning and just none of that happened. And so I went out on the roads, and the roads were just about as bad as I've ever seen them, and we ended up having to call the men at Happy Hill and cancel everything this morning because it was bad enough that I was losing control of the car just getting into town, and that was unusual. So I'm really happy to get to be with you this morning. I want to look at Romans chapter 12 with you all, and especially towards the end of the chapter, there's one particular verse that I want to look at in verse 18. I want to talk about the practical application of how do we make peace? How do we solve problems between individuals? Here in Romans chapter 12, there in verse 18, Paul says, if possible, as far as it depends on you, live peaceably with all. That is a pretty tall order. And the challenge really comes in here in chapter 12 of what happens whenever it's not necessarily your fault and you still have to live peaceably with all men, as far as it depends on you. How do I overcome some of those hurdles? And what I find in maybe my nature or human nature, or what I perceive to be human nature because I find it in myself to be true, is that as long as I don't overtly do anything negative directly to you, sometimes I'm able to wash my hands with the phrase, I've done all that I can. There's nothing else I can do. I've done all that I can to make peace. And it's their fault, not my fault. There's nothing more that I can do. I've done all that I can by just not being a bad person to start with. And if that was the case, then Paul would just say, well, be a peaceable person. But he says, as far as it depends on you, live peaceably with all. And so, as anybody who's bespectacled and carries a pen in their pocket knows, you solve problems with a flowchart. So, that's what we have this morning. I was going to have this as an overhead, but I don't have an overhead yet. So, I want to hand out, or I want to have Lee hand out, if he doesn't mind, flowcharts, because that's how you always solve problems. If you don't wear spectacles, then you don't solve problems with flowcharts. But for those who do, flowcharts are in hand. So I want to look at biblical principles when it comes to making peace. Some of the verses we're going to be looking at today are going to be verses that aren't necessarily talking about friends or brothers, but sometimes when we get into conflicts with other people, we're not really dealing with friends or brothers in that same way. So we're going to use some passages that maybe use some heightened language. Do we have enough for everybody? Brittany's already seen the flowchart, so I think she's good. So we're going to look at some passages to talk about this. So this isn't everything you can do to make peace with people, but I think that these, at least four main principles are things that can really work towards resolutions. Like I said, this isn't an exhaustive list, but these are four core principles of what we can do to make peace. I want to begin in Matthew chapter 5. Matthew chapter 5 mentioned before that this passage here is not specifically dealing with how do I solve a problem with my brother or how do I solve a problem with a friend of mine. This is dealing with enemies. But I think the principle that it applies in the extreme of enemies could also very well apply to the less extreme, conflict between individuals who aren't necessarily at each other's throat being enemies. Jesus says here in verse 43, you have heard it was said, you shall love your neighbor and hate your enemy. But I say to you, love your enemies and pray for those who persecute you, so that you may be sons of your Father who is in heaven. For he makes the sun to rise on the evil and on the good. He sends rain on the just and the unjust. For if you love those who love you, what reward do you have? Do not even tax collectors do the same? And if you greet only your brothers, what more are you doing than others? Do not even the Gentiles do the same? You therefore must be perfect as your heavenly Father is perfect. He starts off with the idea that, if you love somebody who just loves you, then that's what everybody does. But we're called to be more than that. And so he says in verse 43, you heard it was said that you love your neighbor and you hate your enemy. But I say to you that you love your enemy and you pray for those who persecute you. I would suggest the first thing, if you come into conflict with a brother or a sister or a friend or a non-brother or non-sister or a non-friend, if you are having conflicts between you and somebody else, oftentimes we resort to anything other than praying to God. It's not that we don't resort to praying to God. Maybe it's just that it slips our mind. And so the very first thing on the flow chart, if you like flow charts, I like flow charts, is the question of, have you prayed for them? There's a lot that can happen in prayer. Sometimes it's personal. It can be quite a bit harder if you earnestly pray for somebody to harbor ill will for them. If you really open your heart up in prayer to God, asking for good and blessings upon them, asking for them to have a heart that is changed, asking for a resolution to be made, or for you to see the solution to the problem that is there, or asking God to help you to see what you can do for them. Sometimes just the process of prayer can really change somebody's heart. And maybe the conflict's there, and you have it in your mind that it's 100% them, and it never has anything to do with you. And if they don't get off their high horse and come and beg at your feet, then there's never going to be any solution. And sometimes prayer can help you to see that maybe you have equal sharing in the fault, or you hold the lion's share in the fault, or just change your heart towards them, even if they are in the wrong. Now, prayer doesn't always change everything, but it is a really, really, really good start. Paul prays for the lost who he comes in contact with. He prays for the churches who are having fights amongst themselves. He prays for everybody that he seems to come in contact with. So if the answer is yes, you have earnestly prayed for them, then I would suggest the next step comes in Matthew chapter 18. And we're going to look at Matthew 18 and verse 15. The next question is, have you talked to them? Jesus says in Matthew chapter 18 and in verse 15, if your brother sins against you, go and tell him his fault between you and him alone. If he listens to you, then you have gained your brother. It mentions if he does not listen, then take one or two others along with you, that every charge may be established, will be evidence of 2 or 3 witnesses. And then if he refuses them, then tell it to the church. He has a process here of, I have an issue with you, I need to go and talk to you. There's a lot of things that oftentimes are assumed, and usually assumed very wrongly, if I never talk to you. And interesting enough, he mentions here in verse 15 that you go and you talk to them alone first. We have a gut reaction for whatever reason that if I have a conflict with John, I'm going to go ask advice from Lee on how to deal with John. Now, asking advice is a great thing. But there's a way to do that is right, and there's a way to do that is awfully wrong. Sometimes me asking advice from Lee is really just me complaining about John and hoping that I have a sympathetic ear, that he's going to complain also about John, that me and him can have a grievance together, and me and him are on the same team of being angry at John. Sorry, John, I don't mean to throw you under all the buses. But there's a conflict in that. There is oftentimes impure motives in seeking advice, and so Jesus says you go and you talk to that person alone. Maybe that's going to solve the problem. Maybe there's a misunderstanding. Maybe that they are going to be repentant in the process. Maybe you are in the wrong and you come to a better understanding. There's a million possibilities of what could be if you simply talk to them. And yet, the devil is going to do everything he can to keep you from praying to God. He's going to distract you by 1,000 other things to keep that from being an important issue in your life, to pray for those who you are in conflict with. He's going to try his very best to make sure that you don't talk to him. He'll give you 1,000 excuses of they're not going to do any, and it's not going to do any good. I don't trust them. I don't want to speak to them. I'm just going to be opening a can of worms. It's not going to help anything. There's 1,000 things that comes in your mind before you actually sit down and talk to them. You can have the fear and the anxiety of the conflict and what might be if the conflict isn't resolved during that sit-down talk. There's all kinds of things that you're going to have presented to you of, hey, how about you not talk to them? How about you let this fester and let this keep going? And I would suggest here as a side note, James chapter 1 and in verse 19. While James is not necessarily talking about a conflict between two individuals here in chapter 1, I think the application or the principle certainly is applicable there in verse 19. There is a certain demeanor that we should all have as Christians when it comes to communicating back and forth to other people. And the principle that he gives in verse 19 is, he says, "Know this, my beloved brother, let every person be quick to hear and slow to speak and slow to anger. For the anger of man does not produce the righteousness of God." That whenever I go and I talk to John, sorry, John, we're going to follow on the same terrible path. Once you follow down the rabbit trail, you got to keep on going. That my intention is not to give John a piece of my mind. My intention is not for me to be quick to speak to him and to condemn him for all that he's done. I should be quick to hear and then slow to speak. And in conjunction with that principle of wanting to listen and wanting to understand before I voice all of my thoughts is also the idea that I'm going to restrain myself. That anger isn't going to be boiling to the surface, that I'm going to be able to put my personal interest aside long enough to truly understand where he's coming from, so that if I'm wrong, I'm allowed to be corrected at that point in time. Or if he's wrong, he can see the love that I have for him and maybe be willing to hear through that as well. So we've prayed for them, and we've done it earnestly with a pure heart. We've talked to them with the intention of listening and understanding. But maybe the conflict isn't resolved yet. Maybe there's an issue that we haven't worked through. I understand him, but we aren't in simpatico, whatever that other non-English phrase is. So that's not where we end. As much as praying is great and a huge principle in our lives, as much as talking to them is a necessity for working through issue, I can't say, okay, well, I talked to him, therefore I've washed my hands, I've done all that I can do. The Bible gives me more responsibilities that I need to do. And that comes over into Romans chapter 14. And we won't spend all of our time in Romans chapter 14. But here in Romans 14 is areas in verse 1. He deals with those areas of opinion. He tells us in verse 1, "As for the one who is weak in faith, welcome him, but do not quarrel over opinions." So chapter 14 is not dealing with matters of doctrine. This is matters of opinion. There are some things that I can compromise and I can sacrifice, and doctrine is not one of them. If we want to say, well, we're going to start sacrificing goats, and I say, well, let's compromise and let's only do sheep. That's not a compromise that we can come to. It's not right for us to sacrifice goats or sheep in the worship of God. And so that's not a compromise. But when it comes to the holidays, as he talks about chapter 14, the eating of meats in chapter 14, as Paul deals with in 1 Corinthians chapter 8 and 9 of taking along a believing wife or taking pay. There's a variety of subjects that are all just matters of opinion. And here in Romans chapter 14, he gives a list of things that if you are the weak person, then you have like two responsibilities towards the strong person in chapter 14. Don't pass judgment, and you keep your faith to yourself. He then gives a much longer list to the strong person of all the things that you should be willing to do for the weak person. And then he gives a list in chapter 14 of the things that we should do together for one another. In fact, there's kind of four lists that he weaves together. The fourth one is, what is my responsibility and your responsibility towards God? But the thing I want to talk about here in chapter 14 is, what is it I, if I view myself as a strong person, should do? And generally speaking, not always, but generally speaking, we approach Romans 14 from the standpoint of, I'm the strong one. Whatever this conflict is, I have reasoned it out, I have thought through it, I have studied it, and I have come to my conclusions. Therefore, I'm the strong one, and they're the one who hasn't reasoned it or thought it through or have grown as far as I have on these issues. And if that's the case, Paul still gives you all the responsibilities. And he says, on matters of opinion, you be willing to bear with the failings of the weak, to give up your liberties in order to serve their best interests at heart. And this is a where possible scenario. So what if they are, in our opinions, in the wrong, creating the conflict, that they're driving this strife between us? Well, I've prayed for them earnestly, and I've talked to them, and I try to understand their side of things, but they still, in my mind, maybe they're not where they need to be. But the responsibility in Romans 14 is not for me to say, well, you need to take care of yourself. You need to grow where you need to be. It's for me as a stronger person, in my opinion, to be willing to compromise and to sacrifice for them. Even if they are the weak, even if they are in the wrong, possibly. To keep making those things possible. That whatever this area of opinion is, that never matters as much as my brother or my sister does. It never is more important than the spreading of the gospel is. As much as we love meat, as much as we love holidays, they are never more important than the gospel or my brother. That's the principle of Romans 14. So where possible, I'm going to give of myself to my brother. Now, that may solve the problem. That may be the exact issue. If Lee can't be around me when I'm eating meat, then I'm going to eat tofu with Lee. And every time we get together, we're going to have a whole bunch of vegetables and meat substitute. Always. Until he grows past that point. And if he never grows past that point, then I will never eat meat with Lee again. That's going to be the case. If that's the solution that needs to be arrived at, then even if I'm the strong person, then I'm going to make the solution possible. As far as it depends on me, I'm going to live peaceably. But maybe that doesn't resolve the issue. Maybe we're still at loggerheads. Then there's a next step that he gives us. And I want to go back to where we were in Romans chapter 12. So he gives us this principle in verse 18. As far as it depends on you, you live peaceably with all. And then he continues on that same vein in verse 19 and following. He says, beloved, never avenge yourself, but leave it to the wrath of God, for it is written, vengeance is mine, I will repay. To the contrary, if your enemy is hungry, feed him. If he is thirsty, give him something to drink, for by doing so you will heap burning coals on his head. Do not be overcome by evil, but overcome evil with good. Here he is advocating that we do acts of love for them or we fulfill their needs. There's a variety of passages that all deal with this same concept. Oftentimes we don't want to do this one. If we're willing to pray for them and we're willing to talk to them and we're willing to make some compromises and some sacrifices for them, if the conflict is not resolved by this point in time, we most likely are going to wash our hands with I have done all that I can, and as far as it depends on me, I'm going to, I've tried. But Paul gives us the obligation to keep showing love even after the conflict is not resolved yet. And that's hard. It's hard to not be overcome with evil, but to overcome evil with good. But that's my responsibility as a Christian. Even if they're in the wrong, which is what he's dealing with. I am at conflict with somebody else and they're in the wrong, and in their wrong, I'm still going to feed them when they're hungry. I'm still going to clothe them when they're naked. I'm still going to give them of the daily needs of life because my heart isn't closed to them. And that can be a real challenge. There's a purple line at the bottom of your flow chart. If you get to the point where you have loved not just in word, but in deed and in truth, and that still hasn't softened their hearts yet, and you're still in conflict and things haven't resolved, there are some people who would be perfectly happy to tell you all the pieces of their mind. And they'd be perfectly happy to watch you bend over backwards, for you to meet their demands. And then they're going to be perfectly happy for you to keep doing acts of love, and their heart's still going to be hard towards you. Maybe you've met some of those people. And at that point in time, we really want to throw up our hands and say, well, I'm done with this whole scenario. But I think there's a pretty strong biblical principle that we go back to the beginning and we start the process all over again. That we sit down, we talk once. Well, I'm done talking to you. I prayed one time. That's enough for me to pray for you. I offered one compromise or one sacrifice, and that's more than you really deserved. And I took you out to lunch that one time when we sat down and talked, and I paid for lunch, and that was my act of love, and I've done all that I can. And the challenge that I have is in passages like Galatians chapter 2, where Paul calls Jesus our peace, and it reminds us through the entire set of Gospels that he is our peacemaker, and he stands always in the book of Hebrews to make intercessions for us, that we have a living priest, a high priest, who's always there to intercede for us, that if Jesus went through this process of praying for me and listening to me and sacrificing for me and then continuing to shower blessings on my head, and he did that just one time, I would be all out of luck. That wouldn't be enough to soften my heart to him. I'm abundantly blessed that it's not the case for him. He is the ultimate example of an individual who was always in the right and always went out of his way to make peace with other people. Whenever he was wronged, he did not threaten in return, but continued to entrust himself to a faithful God. Look at Romans chapter 7 for a moment. Hebrews chapter 7. Hebrews chapter 7. There's a posture that the Hebrew writer picks up on when it comes to Jesus that I think that is one that I needed to try to adopt more often. The Hebrew writer, in speaking of Jesus and his high priesthood, he makes the point that consequently, in verse 25, Jesus is able to save to the uttermost those who draw near to God through him, since he always lives to make intercession for them. Part of what the Hebrew writer is talking about is that Jesus has eternal life, that he's always there. But if he was always there, but never available to make intercession, if he just existed, but then after once making intercession for you, no longer made intercession for you, then we would all be out of luck. There would be no hope at that point. And he would still be just in that, I think. He would be a gracious and still just God to say, I have done everything once for you, and that's still more than you deserve. But the posture that he holds in verse 25 is that he lives always to make intercession. At what point in time am I able to look at somebody else that I'm in conflict with and say, well, I've made more sacrifices than Jesus made for me. I've listened to you more than Jesus is willing to listen to me. I've made more intercessions for you on your behalf to God than Jesus makes for me. And I have showered you with more love than Jesus showers me with love. There is nobody that I've been in conflict with that I'm able to say that I've done that much for. But he's the example that we have for us. When Jesus opens up the Beatitudes, I'm not going to step on Lee's territory for the next couple of Wednesdays. But he gets in the Beatitudes, and one of the last ones is, blessed are the peacemakers, for they shall be sons of God. Not someone who is peaceable, but someone who is peacemaker, someone who actively seeks that process, who lives to make intercession for other people. And the challenge that I find in my heart as we look over at Romans chapter 12, and he says, well, live peaceably. I read, or my mind says, you be a nice person. You don't cut people off in traffic, and you don't bump into people in the grocery store with your car. Therefore, I am a peaceable person. But that isn't what he's advocating. He's for making it as far as it depends on me, I live peaceably with all men. And that gives me a lot of obligations. And my tendency as a person is to wash my hands far too quickly, claim self-righteously that I have done all that I can do, and then feel good in my heart that I'm right, they're wrong, I wasn't mean to them, therefore I've done all that I can. But the Bible gives me a lot of obligations. And not just a one-time obligation, but a continual seeking for peace, a continual showing of love and advocacy between them and God, and an obligation to truly go and to do and to listen and to talk. And so, this isn't, I don't know all the solutions to all of the problems, and that's okay. Because if I have a pattern to follow, then that'll be enough. Whatever issues may arise between me and Tamika, I was going to say John again, but I felt bad for picking on John again. I don't know what the solution's going to be necessarily, but I know what my obligation is. And again, one of the challenges in any conflict is not to say, Tamika, you haven't lived up to your end of the bargain. Because all of the passage we've looked at is not talking about people who've lived up to their end of the bargain. It's people who haven't lived up to their end of the bargain, and I still do it anyways because I am required to, and I love them enough to do so. And so oftentimes in conflict as well, they're being hypocritical. They want me to do this for them, and they're not willing to do it for me. Yes, that's probably true. It doesn't change your obligations. It doesn't change your relationship with God and what you have to do to be in right standing with Him. And so, what can I do to make peace? Well, probably a lot more than I normally do. Obligations are there, but the blessings are also there. There are so many things that can happen that if you go and you tell your conflict with your brother and he repents, then you've gained a brother. You've covered a multitude of sins. That is a wonderful thing. And I hope that's something that I'm able to look at and say, well, I see the value in their salvation and their repentance as being more valuable than the sacrifices that I make, the uncomfortableness that I have to go through, and maybe the hours of anxiety and worry that I have to deal with. So when I look at Romans chapter 12 and it tells me to, as far as it depends on me, live peaceably with all men, I hope that in the future I'm not somebody who washes my hands too readily, but someone who truly works to live the example that Jesus has for us. So you guys are free to keep the flowcharts because flowcharts solve so many problems. I'll have a weekly challenge for you as well that will kind of remind you of some of the main steps. But I hope that you guys take some time this week and think about people that maybe you currently have or have had conflicts with in the past and ask, have I truly done all that God requires to make peace? Have I given up too quickly? Or have I tried some of the steps, got frustrated that it didn't work automatically, and then never went back and tried again? If that's the case, then we got some work to do. Go and tell the fault between your brother privately. And that doesn't work, take a couple witnesses. Work through the issue and keep on showing love through the whole time. John has picked out a song of invitation. Obviously, the pattern of making peace is established in Jesus. While we were weak and while we were enemies and while we were sinners, Christ died for us, paying the ultimate sacrifice in order to be an advocate who always stands to make intercession. And if we had been in conflict with God, if we're no longer at peace with Him, then this is a perfect time to make that happen. And if we can help you to do that, please let us know as we stand and sing.